Hi everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at the parent constraint option. Constraints are used widely within rigging in Maya. They allow you to attach attributes of one object onto another object. So in other words, you can control the attribute of one object using another object. There are several different types of constraints within Maya. I'm going to try and do a video for each of the basic ones to give you a bit of an idea of what they do, but there's definitely several more advanced constraints or constraints that are a little bit more niche, which I'm not going to cover. Basically, I just want to give you the basic rundown of these, and that way you can kind of practice with them and get used to how the system works. If you decide that you want to kind of work out what the additional constraints do, you can kind of do a bit of research for that where it's appropriate. Okay, so let's have a look. First thing we want to do is get to the constraint menu at the top of the screen. You'll need to switch your animation menus on from the drop down just here, and then we'll pop into the constraint menu. So what I'm going to do for this is just snap this menu off. If you click on this little bar at the top here, it'll snap it off as a little floaty window, and then you can just pop it over to the side. The reason for this is I'm going to be using several of these options, and it just saves me going back up to the menu each time. Obviously these will be split over several videos. Okay, so the first constraint that we've got here is a parent constraint. So what I'm going to do here is just create a couple of objects. Okay, so I've got a couple of cubes here. I'm just going to reduce the size of one of these, just so we can differentiate the two. And I've done that by reducing the components rather than just scaling the entire object down. That's going to keep my scale values at 1 at the default. Okay, I'm going to place this main cube, the big one, into the middle of the grid as well. That way, basically, this cube has all of its translates, rotates, and scales in the default settings, which is 0s and 1s. That'll also give us a chance to take a look at some of the options which may affect this in ways that we don't necessarily expect right now. Okay, so let's take a look at the parent constraint options. At the moment I'm not going to select anything because I'm just going to open the options up by clicking the option box at the end of the menu here. Now, most of these options are actually going to be very similar to the other constraint types. So I'm not necessarily going to keep going through all of these in each video. I'll point out where there are differences, but for the most part, a lot of these are going to be exactly the same. Okay, so we've looked at parenting in other videos, and that's been sort of just the basic edit parent option. And we know from parenting, essentially what it's going to do is take a child object, it's going to attach it to a parent object, and the child is then going to inherit any sort of rotation, scale, or positional changes we make to the parent. But we can also sort of change those attributes directly on the child itself without affecting the parent. So it's sort of like a one-way transfer of information, okay, from the parent down to the child. So that would allow us to control the child with the parent, but still be able to independently, modify the child if we want to. Now the parent constraint is going to do a similar thing. What it's going to do is link our translates and our rotates. You can see here in the constraint axes, we've got translate all, and we've got rotate all, and then below we've got each individual axis, X, Y, and Z, for both of them. For both of those channels. As with the regular parenting system, where we've got sort of a preserve position option, which will keep the child where it is when we create the connection to the parent. Constraints also have maintain offset, and essentially what that is it's going to keep the object, the controlled object, in its original location. So to see how this works, the selection of your objects, the order of selection, is important with this, in the same way that it is for a normal edit parent option. The difference here is that the roles are reversed, or the selection order is reversed. With normal parenting, we select the child and then we select the parent. With a constraint version, what we do is we select the controlling object and then we select any of the objects that we want to have controlled by the controlling object. So basically the order is the other way around from normal parenting. Okay, so we select the controlling object, the controller, and then we shift select all of the remote or controlled objects. Okay, so then what we do is we can hit apply, and that's going to apply a parent constraint. Now I'm going to open the outliner so you can see what happens here. I'm going to click on the outliner list. All right, I'm just going to drop that down, and you can see we've got our two cubes. So what I might do is actually name these. So cube 1 is control, and cube 2 is controlled. Okay, so I've got my control and I've got my controlled. And then what I'm going to do is hit apply. Now you'll notice, unlike with parenting, adding a parent constraint doesn't change the way that these objects are selected. They're still both selected in exactly the same way. And if we didn't have this outliner open, we wouldn't necessarily know, just by looking here in the viewport, that anything had changed at all. But there are a couple of giveaways. The first is that because we had our controlled object selected second or last, the channel box, if we had that open, would be showing the settings for that object. And I can see over here, translate X and the translate and rotate channels over here, or attributes, now have a blue indicator next to them. Okay, that's sort of, you know, sign 1 that something has happened. Sign 2 is that I've now got a little expansion button here next to my controlled object. That's the small cube. If I click on that, it shows that I've got a constraint, a parent constraint there. So I can see, and a little chain link button. So I can see that the controlled object has a constraint on it, and that's kind of signifying that it's linked to something else. Okay, so that's a couple of ways to determine that something is controlling or linked to this. Now, if I click just out of the object for a minute, if I select the master object or the control object like this, there's really nothing on here at all that suggests that anything is controlling it. Okay, I'm going to close off this options for a second. If I grab my move tool and I move the master object here, or the control object, you'll see that the little controlled object goes with it, like this. Likewise, if I rotate it, you'll see that it rotates. Now notice it's rotating as though the center of this object, or the pivot point for this object, is actually where the control object is. Right? This is reading its rotational position from the location of this object. So it orbits around the object instead of just spinning on the spot. Okay, now there is a way of doing that using a different constraint, which we'll look at in another video. Okay, so you can see if I take this cube and I rotate it like that, and then I take this object and I rotate it as well, notice this cube jumps back to where it was. Okay, its rotation resets, at least here on screen. So if I move this, see how it just realigns like that? The reason for that is that this rotation is really being controlled by this. So you can see here, if I move this rotation around to, let's type in a number here to get this exactly to a specific number. If I type in 45 degrees here for the rotate Y, that's the position that this cube is moving to, okay, or rotating to. If I select this cube, you'll see that the rotation Y value is exactly the same, just there. Okay, but it's not really spinning itself. It's basically going to orbit around this one. Okay. Now, in most of the constraints, what you are going to have is a setting which is the weight. Okay. Now, in this, what this is control, which is this object name, and the weight 0 is set to 1. Now the weight 0, you can actually have multiple constraints attached to the same object. So in this case you would have, you know, if we had multiples, it would probably say weight 0, weight 1, weight 2, weight 3, up to however many constraining connections we've got. Now this number here, 1, is basically almost like an on-off. You can look at it as being like an on-off value. When it's set to 1, the constraint is fully active and the controlled object will move with the control object. Okay. When we dial this down to 0, so let me just reset the rotation on this for a second. Okay, so we're back to where we started. If I go into control 0 and I set that down to 0 like this, note that I can just click and drag on the number left and right and it will basically dial this down. Okay, if I now select this value, this object, and I turn it, notice how nothing happens over here. Okay, the cube, the controlled cube, is no longer responding to that constraint. And it's because we've essentially turned the constraint off. If I go back to the cube and I turn the weight back up to 1, it will then snap back into place. Okay, so this is we can do things like you know, have we can use a constraint, for instance, to have a character walk up to an object and pick the object up, and then have that object remain in the character's hand as it moves the hand around, and then we can have the character release the object, and we do that by animating the control weight on and off, or the weight of this constraint on and off. So when it's off, we can basically have the object released, and when it's active, basically the object will jump back into the hand. Now keep in mind, it will literally jump from wherever it is to its sort of connected position to its controlling object. So in essence, you could have something kind of fly across the room into a character's hand by using that kind of system, by animating that weight on and off. Okay, so let's just quickly have a look at a couple of other options in there. We've used the default settings. Basically what we're going to do now is take a look at one or two other things that can change the way that this functions. So I'm going to get rid of that constraint. I'm going to select the constraint there and just delete it. And that just leaves us with our two spheres again. Okay. Let's go back into parent constraint options. There we go. Now, I'm going to show you what happens with maintain offset. Okay, so I'm selecting my controlling object, I'm selecting my controlled object, I'm going to turn off maintain offset, and then I'm going to hit apply. And you can see that that cube has disappeared. Now, what's actually happened is that cube, if I switch on this X-ray just here, that cube has basically jumped to the position of the controlling cube, the big cube. Okay. Because we've told it to not stay where it is, we've deactivated that option, it's going to try and match the same position and the same rotation as the controlling object. Therefore, it's going to jump to the middle of the cube. Okay, so you'll need to keep that in mind. If you're using constraints, especially if you're on a shared computer where there is no login, you may find that the settings that have been used by somebody else on your computer, they may have turned this off for a particular reason. And so when you come in and you do your constraints, it's making objects jump sort of into unexpected places. And in some cases, obviously, like when we're not looking at it in X-ray mode, it looks like that other cube just disappeared. It just deleted itself. Now I can see that it's not deleted because the object is still here. Technically speaking, to find it, what I could do is turn the move tool on and then click on that controlled object, and the move tool basically will show me its location. And from that I can kind of deduce, okay, yeah, obviously it's inside this other cube where I can't see it. But that's something that people who are beginning with this software, that'll confuse people. And it'll make them think their objects are sort of deleting themselves. So just be aware of that. That's something to look out for. Okay. Now, let's just undo that. There we go. So back to where we were. I'm going to select my two objects again. And this time I'm going to hit maintain offset. But what I'm going to do is change a couple of these options. Instead of using translate all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use X and I'm going to use Z axes for translate. My rotate, I'm just going to use Y. So these are the settings I'm going to constrain. So over on the channel box, it's going to be this one, and then this one. Those are the settings that are going to get parented or constrained using this set of options. So I'm going to apply that or add that. There we go. Now I had maintain offset on, so that way you can see both cubes. All right, so let's grab the master cube. I can see that I've got the parent constraint there. So that should be fine. If I click on the parent constraint, I can see that my control weight is 1, so it's active. So if I grab my my sort of controlling object and I grab the move tool, move tool. If I move the control object on the x-axis, which is this one just here, I can see that down here. Okay, X is this direction, which is this handle. If I grab that and I move it, I can see that the cube, the little control cube, is going to go with it. So that's working. If I grab the Z-axis, which is the blue one, like this, and I drag that, I can see that that works. That's cool. But the Y-axis, I didn't constrain the Y-axis on the settings, right? So if I grab this one and I move up and down, this probably shouldn't move. You can see that there, it's not moving. All right? So that's interesting. Now there are, we could think up of, ways that we could implement that kind of action. We might have an object that needs to move up and down, so it might be maybe something on a crane. So this might have to move up and down to lower lower some cargo or something, but we don't want this to move. But then when the crane actually moves across somewhere like this, then we would want this to go, this might be part of the crane, we would want that to go with it. So this might be the little, the cabin where the crane operator sits, for instance. So what we might want to do is have him be able to lift this up and down, or maybe it's even a forklift. We want this to be able to go up and down so the cargo can get lifted up and down. And we want to be able to move, this way and this way to line up with the shelves or the racks or the, the boat that we're trying to load this stuff onto. And we might be able to go this way and this way to kind of move it into position, bring it over the top of the shelf when it's at the right height. But we don't want this basically to move up and down with the cargo. So that might be a simplistic sort of way that we could kind of work out that kind of system. Now let's have a look at rotation. With the rotation, we only constrain the y-axis, which is this currently yellow ring. Okay, that's like the spin. So if I grab the z-axis, which is this blue one, okay, you can see that that's having a bit of a weird kind of effect. We're not moving the object, and we're not rotating something that was constrained, but we're having this weird piston effect where that cube is moving in and out. Okay, so that's a bit of an unexpected kind of result. potentially. If I use the X value, okay, based on the fact that the Z rotation did something similar, the X value is also doing something similar there. Okay, where it's sort of creating like a piston effect, but the other way around. Now, the thing that we did expect to happen was the following one, and that's this green handle, which is the Y-axis. That's the one that we connected. So if I click and drag that, you can see that that's actually going to spin with it. Like that. And we're going to get that orbiting. So you can see that the parenting constraint doesn't quite work the same way as normal parenting. With the normal parenting, we can kind of modify this by itself, you know, to whatever we want. And then whatever we do with the parent, this is going to remain with the changes we gave it. With this, it's not. With a constraint, it doesn't do that. It'll just reset it as soon as we do that. And if we try and keyframe this into a different position, it'll actually give us errors. So this is sort of more like a live kind of automated connection that's occurring. So that's sort of the parent constraint system. I'm going to do a video for the other ones as well, for a few more of these, not all of them, but just to show you sort of what they do. As I said, a lot of the settings work the same way, so I'm not going to really go through all of the settings. They're going to be very similar to this, but it's just sort of more to point out what each of these ones does. So I'm going to leave this video here, and I'll see you again in the next one.